New York City, 2:13 a.m., inside an abandoned warehouse by the river. The gun pressed hard beneath Ellie Vance's jaw. Sing, Marcus Sterling hissed, his face twisted with rage. Or die knowing Julian Thorne never came for you. Ellie's wrists bled against the chains, but her eyes stayed dry. Across the smoke-filled room, Julian stepped through the shattered wall, blood on his shirt, guns in both hands, his expression cold enough to stop every breath in the room. Let her go, Julian said, voice low and deadly. Marcus laughed, tightening his grip in Ellie's hair. One more step, Mafia boss, and I end your little Aria forever. Ellie slowly lifted her chin. Then she opened her mouth not to beg, but to sing. And before the final note broke the glass above them, let me take you back to the night a humiliated waitress became the most dangerous woman in a mafia empire. Watch until the end, and don't forget to subscribe. The Ivory Room did not serve wine, it served status. Every glass that left the bar carried a price tag steep enough to feed a family for a month, and every person who drank it knew that, and wanted you to know it too. Ellie Vance knew the room better than anyone in it. She had memorized the acoustics on her first shift. The way sound bounced off the marble floor and died in the velvet drapes near the east wall. She knew which tables complained about slow service and which ones tipped in cash so their wives wouldn't see the receipt. She knew all of it. And none of it mattered, because to the people sitting at those tables, she was furniture that happened to carry a tray. She was 24. 2 years ago, she'd been a soprano at Juilliard with a scholarship and a future. Now she balanced glasses of champagne on a silver tray and tried not to be noticed. Because being noticed at the Ivory Room usually meant being mocked. Chloe Harrington noticed her anyway. You, Chloe said, snapping her fingers the way she might call a dog. My glass is empty. Ellie crossed the room, careful, steady, the way she'd trained herself to move so nothing spilled and nothing broke. She reached the table. Chloe shifted her chair at the exact wrong second. A small motion. Deliberate. And the tray tipped. Red wine arced through the air and landed across Chloe's white dress like a wound. The room went quiet. Then Chloe screamed. Do you have any idea what this dress cost? Do you have any idea what you cost? Compared to it. Her voice climbed, sharp and delighted, the kind of cruelty that enjoys an audience. Look at her. They hire anyone these days. I guess when you're built like that. Waitressing is the only job that'll take you. Laughter rippled through the nearby tables. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Ellie stood there and let it happen. She had learned, over 2 years of trays and tips, and men who looked through her like glass, that fighting back only fed people like Chloe. So she said nothing. She reached for a napkin to blot the mess. And that was when a voice cut through the room, low and unbothered, like a man remarking on the weather. That dress cost $12,000. And it just became the least interesting thing at this table. Julian Thorne hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. Every head turned toward the corner booth where he sat alone, a glass of scotch untouched in front of him. His suit the kind of black that seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. Everyone in that room knew his name. Everyone knew what his name meant, and what it had cost other people to learn it. Julian, Chloe said, straightening, hopeful, like his interruption might be a rescue. It wasn't. You embarrassed yourself in front of 30 people over spilled wine, Julian said. That tells me everything about your character. And none of it is good. He reached into his jacket, unhurried, and set a gun on the white tablecloth. Not aimed. Just placed there, the way another man might set down a set of keys. Except a gun on a tablecloth changes the temperature of a room instantly. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed too loud. Here's what we'll do, Julian said, looking at Chloe now. And there was nothing warm in it. There's an aria from Tosca. VC Dart. Difficult. Most trained singers hold the top of it without cracking. Our waitress here is going to sing it for us. He turned to Ellie for the first time. His eyes were the kind of gray that gave nothing away. If she sings it clean, he said, I marry her. Tonight, I put a ring on her finger. And you spend the rest of your life explaining to people why the mafia boss chose a waitress over you. If she fails, you lose a kneecap. Your choice which one. Chloe laughed, but it shook. This is insane. It's a wager, Julian said. Everyone in this room loves a wager. Sing Ellie. He knew her name. She filed that away quietly, the way she filed away everything. She could have refused, she could have run. Instead, something old woke up in her chest. Something she'd buried under 2 years of trays and silence and Chloe Harrington's. She set down her tray. She straightened her spine the way her old vocal coach had taught her. Shoulders back, ribs open, and she breathed from the bottom of her lungs for the first time in longer than she could remember. Then she sang. The first note left her, and the room forgot how to move. It wasn't loud, not at first. It built, climbing through the melody with a control that silenced every whisper in the place. Near the bar, a crystal champagne flute cracked clean down the middle, a thin, bright sound like ice breaking on a lake. Nobody had touched it. She held the final note longer than she needed to. She wanted every person who had laughed to feel it in their teeth. When it ended, nobody clapped. They were too stunned. Julian rose from the booth, crossed the room slowly, and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see he wasn't smiling. Exactly, but something in his face had shifted. Pack your things, future Mrs. Thorne. Ellie looked down at the wine still drying on her hands. She thought about her father, about the file she'd never been allowed to see, about the years she'd spent invisible on purpose. Phase 1 complete, she thought. Now I burn his empire to the ground. The car that took her from the ivory room was black, long and silent inside, like riding in a sealed box. Ellie sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the city thin out into hills. Then gates, then a driveway that curved for what felt like half a mile before the house finally came into view. It wasn't a house, it was a fortress dressed up as one, stone and glass perched on a cliff above the water, with floodlights buried in the landscaping so the whole place glowed at night like something built to be seen from a distance and admired, or feared. A week ago, she'd been counting quarters to make rent on an apartment with a roach problem she'd stopped bothering to report. Now a man in a suit was carrying her one duffel bag up marble stairs like it was luggage from a hotel. She understood the difference between a fairy tale and a hostage situation. This was the second one, dressed up to look like the first. Julian met her in the entryway. He'd changed out of his dinner jacket into something simpler, dark sweater, dark pants. And without the suit, he looked less like a headline and more like a man who hadn't slept properly in years. You'll have the East Wing, he said. Nobody goes in without your permission. That includes me. Generous, Ellie said. For a man who bought me with a bet. Something flickered across his face. There and gone. I didn't buy you. I made a wager against a woman who deserved to lose it. What you do with the win is up to you. She almost laughed. Almost. And if I want to leave, then we'll have a longer conversation, he said, and didn't elaborate. And she understood the shape of the threat without him needing to say it plainly. That was the thing about men like Julian Thorne. They didn't waste words on cruelty when silence did the job for them. He showed her to her room himself. Past hallways lined with art that probably cost more than the building she used to live in. The East Wing had its own sitting room, a piano nobody had touched in what looked like years, and a closet already stocked with clothes in her size, tags still on. Someone got your measurements without asking, she said. Someone always does. Julian said. That's how this life works. I'd rather you know it up front than find out the hard way. He left her alone after that, and for the first time in longer than she could remember. Ellie stood in a room and didn't have to worry about anyone watching her eat, or judging what she wore, or laughing when she reached for a second helping. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like standing in a very beautiful trap, waiting to learn where the wire was. The stylist arrived the next morning. Her name was Priya, brisk and efficient, with a rolling rack of gowns and a measuring tape draped around her neck like a stethoscope. She took one look at Ellie and reached for a boned corset with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd done this 100 times and expected no argument. We'll need to cinch you in for the fittings, Priya said. Mr. Thorne wants the silhouette streamlined. It'll hide some of the well, you understand. Ellie understood exactly. She'd spent a lifetime hearing variations of that sentence, softened just enough to sound like advice instead of insult. She held still while Priya looped the corset around her ribs and pulled again. until breathing became a negotiation instead of an automatic thing her body knew how to do. A little more, Priya murmured, tightening the laces. You'll thank me when you see the photos. The door opened without a knock. Julian stood in the frame, and whatever expression had been on his face when he walked in disappeared fast, replaced by something flat and cold that made Priya's hand still on the laces. Take it off, he said, Mr. Thorne, the silhouette requires I said take it off. His voice hadn't risen, but the room seemed to shrink around it. Priya's fingers moved fast after that, unlacing what had taken 5 minutes to tighten. Ellie breathed in, deep, and felt her ribs expand for the first time in what felt like an hour. You're finished here, Julian told Priya. Someone will settle what you're owed. Don't come back. Priya left without arguing, rolling her rack out the door so quickly the hangers clattered against each other. Julian waited until the door clicked shut, then turned to Ellie, and his voice softened into something she hadn't heard from him yet. You do not shrink yourself for anyone in this house, he said, not for a dress, not for a photograph, not for me. That's a strange thing to hear from a man who won me in a bet. I won a wager against a woman who insulted you in front of a room full of people, Julian said. What happens under my roof is different. You take up whatever space you need to take up. That's not negotiable, and it's not a favor. It's the baseline. Ellie studied him, trying to find the angle. The catch. The part where this turned out to be another version of the same old trick. She didn't find one. Not yet. Why does it matter to you? She asked. Because I've spent my whole life around people who think respect and fear are the same thing, Julian said. I'm trying to build something different. If I can't manage that in my own house, I don't deserve to manage it anywhere else. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years, and she didn't know what to do with it, so she said nothing at all. That night, once the house had gone quiet, Ellie put on the robe from the closet and walked the halls she'd been shown, memorizing turns, counting doors, filing away which hallways had cameras mounted in the corners and which ones didn't. 2 years of being invisible had taught her one useful skill. People stop noticing you eventually, and once they stopped noticing, they stopped being careful. She found Julian's study on the second floor, door closed but not locked. A heavy wooden thing with a keypad and a small glass panel beside the handle. A fingerprint reader. She'd seen enough of them in movies to recognize what she was looking at, though she had no plan yet for how to use it. Only the instinct that information was the only currency she had left in a house like this. Voices drifted from the far end of the hallway, low, careful, the tone people use when they don't want to be overheard. She pressed herself into the shadow of a bookshelf and listened. 2 guards stood near a side door, one holding a radio that crackled every few seconds with a strange, deliberate rhythm. Not static, not chatter. A pattern, short bursts and long bursts, over and over, like something tapped out on purpose. Ellie had spent 4 years at Juilliard training her ear to catch rhythm inside chaos, to hear the difference between an accident and an intention. This was an intention. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew, standing in the dark with her back against a stranger's books, that whatever secret this house was keeping, it had just started keeping it in front of the wrong person. She went back to her room before anyone noticed she'd left it, and lay awake a long time, listening to the ocean below the cliff, thinking about fingerprints and rhythm and the strange kindness of a man who'd fired a stylist over a corset. Kindness didn't erase the gun on the tablecloth, but it complicated the picture, and complications, Ellie had learned, were where the real leverage lived. It took her 4 days to get close enough to Julian's hand without raising suspicion. She used the piano. Every evening after dinner, Julian retreated to his study. But before that, for maybe 20 minutes, he sat in the music room with a glass of scotch, half listening while Ellie played scales to keep her fingers loose. On the 4th night, she asked him to turn the pages of a piece she claimed she couldn't remember. He leaned over the bench, one hand braced on the wood beside her, and when she reached to steady the sheet music, her fingers brushed his, just enough, just long enough. Later, in her room, she pressed a strip of clear tape against the pad of her own thumb where his print had transferred, and held it to the light, checking the ridges. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be perfect. It needed to fool a reader, designed to keep out strangers who'd never been inside the house at all. She waited until 2 in the morning, when the halls were empty and the guards on rotation had settled into the low, bored rhythm of men who didn't expect trouble. She pressed the tape against the study's fingerprint reader. The panel blinked green. The safe sat behind a painting, an ordinary landscape, hills and a river, the kind of art that existed to be forgotten. Behind it, a keypad. She'd watched Julian enter it once, weeks ago, without meaning to. Her eyes catching the motion of his hand out of habit. 4 digits. She typed them in. The safe opened. For one long second, Ellie felt something close to triumph. The first clean, uncomplicated feeling she'd had since the night at the ivory room. Then the light snapped on, and Julian was standing in the doorway with a gun leveled at her chest. And the triumph collapsed into something much colder. "I wondered how long it would take you," he said. "You knew. I ran a background check the moment you finished that aria." His voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end before it started. "It didn't take long to find your real name. Eleanor Vance, daughter of Michael Vance. A man my organization supposedly killed 9 years ago." Ellie's hands had gone cold. Every plan she'd built, every careful step, collapsed at once. Because she understood now that she had never once been ahead of him. She had walked into his house believing she was the one setting the trap, and the whole time she had been standing inside somebody else's. So this whole time, she said, the room, the corset, all of it was real. Julian said, "I don't lie about the things that matter. But yes, I knew who you were before you ever set foot in this house." For a moment she considered begging. The old instinct, the one that had kept her small and quiet and unnoticed for 2 years, told her that begging might buy her something. A few more seconds. A chance to run. She looked at the gun in his hand, steady, aimed, and she made a choice instead. "Shoot me then," she said. "But before you do, you should know the guard at the south gate has been tapping a code into his radio every night for the last 4 nights. And there's a car bomb wired under your SUV, set to go off at 6 in the morning." The gun didn't waver, but something behind Julian's eyes did. "Say that again." Morse, short bursts, long bursts. "The same pattern every night around midnight. I trained as a musician. I hear rhythm the way other people hear language. Somebody in this house has been sending information out. And I'd bet my life it connects to whoever's planning to blow up your car." He lowered the weapon, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The safe sat open between them, forgotten now. The papers inside it, suddenly irrelevant compared to what she'd just told him. "Who sent you?" he asked finally. "Nobody sent me," Ellie said. "I came here to find out who killed my father and make them pay for it. I didn't expect to end up saving your life instead." Julian studied her the way a man studies a hand of cards he'd underestimated. "The ghost of a man I supposedly murdered, working under my own roof. That's either the worst luck I've had in years, or the best. Depends which one of us is asking," Ellie said. He set the gun down on the desk, and something in the gesture, deliberate, unhurried, told her he'd already made his decision. "We're going to check that SUV before 6, he said. "And then you and I are going to have a much longer conversation about what you actually know, and what I actually did or didn't do to your father. Is that a truce?" "It's a start," Julian said. "Trust comes later, if it comes at all. But you just saved my life over information you didn't have to share. I don't forget things like that." Ellie looked at the open safe, the gun on the desk, the man standing in front of her who had every reason in the world to pull that trigger and hadn't. She thought about her father's name, spoken out loud in this house for the first time in 9 years, and felt the shape of her plan shift under her, not broken, just changed, pointed now at a target she hadn't expected to find standing so close. The SUV, when the mechanics finally pulled it apart at 4 in the morning under floodlights in the garage, had a device wired beneath the driver's seat exactly where Ellie said it would be. Julian watched it get disarmed in silence, arms crossed, jaw tight. And when it was over, he didn't thank her out loud. He simply looked at her differently after that, the way a man looks at a chess piece he'd mistaken for a pawn. They talked properly the next afternoon, in the music room, with the door closed and 2 cups of coffee going cold between them. My father built this organization on fear, bodies in warehouses, families threatened into silence, the whole ugly machine. I inherited it at 26 because he put a bullet in his own head rather than face what he'd built. I've spent 8 years trying to turn it into something that doesn't require that kind of ending. And my father, your father worked with mine, before I was old enough to understand what that meant, Julian said. I don't know everything that happened between them. I know the official story says my father killed him over a debt. I also know my father lied about almost everything. So I've never trusted that story completely. Then who do you trust? Almost no one, Julian admitted, except maybe you, as of last night. Which tells you how bad the rest of my options are. She laughed despite herself, short and surprised, and he almost smiled back. He told her about Marcus Sterling then, his underboss, the man who'd been at his father's side since before Julian was born. The man everyone assumed was loyal because loyalty was easier to assume than to verify. Julian had started noticing gaps. Shipments that didn't match their manifests. Meetings that ended differently than they'd been planned. Someone some close to him was talking to people who shouldn't be listening. I need eyes at the gala next week, Julian said. Somewhere I can't be seen watching. Capos talk differently when they think no one important is nearby. You want me to spy for you. I want you to use the thing everyone in that room will assume is a weakness, Julian said. Nobody watches their words around the help. You proved that yourself. The night I met you. It should have felt like an insult. Instead, it felt like an offer. The first real use of her invisibility she'd ever been handed on purpose instead of forced into by circumstance. And in exchange, she said, I get the file, everything you have on my father. Everything I have. Julian agreed. Whatever it costs me. They shook on it. And something about the formality of the gesture. 2 people who'd started as captor and hostage now negotiating like equals. Settled the last of the tension between them into something steadier. That evening, restless, Ellie wandered the guest wing looking for a book to read, and found instead a locked drawer in a desk nobody used, the wood slightly warped from age. She worked it open with a hairpin, more out of habit than intention, and found a folder of bank statements tucked beneath old correspondence. The account belonged to Marcus Sterling. The deposits were small at first, then larger, arriving every few weeks from an offshore account with no obvious connection to the syndicate's usual business. She sat on the floor of the guest wing with the folder in her lap and understood, with total clarity, that she was looking at the rat Julian had been hunting for months. She thought about walking straight to Julian's study and handing it over. Instead, she photographed every page with her phone and put the folder back exactly as she'd found it. Corners aligned, dust undisturbed. Trust between her and Julian was still new, still fragile, and she'd learned a long time ago that information handled carefully was worth far more than information handed over too soon. She had spent 2 years being underestimated by people who never once bothered to look at her twice. Now, for the first time, she had proof, hidden in her own phone. That being overlooked wasn't a weakness at all. It was the best kind of cover there was. Downstairs. Faintly, she could hear Julian at the piano, picking out a melody badly, one note at a time. Clearly self-taught and clearly out of practice. She sat at the top of the stairs and listened for a long while before she went to bed, thinking that whatever this house turned out to be in the end, cage or shelter or something in between, she was no longer walking through it blind. The gown arrived 3 days before the gala, delivered in a garment bag so long it needed 2 people to carry it up the stairs. Ellie unzipped it alone in her room and stood there for a full minute just looking at it. Deep green silk, cut to skim her body instead of fighting it. No boning, no cinching, nothing built to hide her. A note was pinned to the strap. Told the designer to build around you, not against you. Wear it however makes you feel like yourself. She thought about the corset in the first week. The way Priya's hands had pulled the laces tighter and tighter while telling her it was for her own good. This dress was the opposite of that conversation, and she understood, standing in front of the mirror in her room, that Julian had been listening even in the moments she hadn't realized he was paying attention. The gala took place at the Sterling estate, which felt to Ellie like walking into enemy territory even before she knew for certain that Marcus was the enemy. Golden light spilled from every window. Waitstaff moved through the crowd with trays, invisible in exactly the way she used to be, and she caught herself watching them with something close to recognition, like seeing an old version of herself dressed in someone else's uniform. Julian met her at the base of the staircase. He wore black, as always. But something in the way he looked at her when she came down the stairs made the whole room feel smaller, quieter, like the noise had been turned down just for the two of them. "You look like you own the room," he said. "I plan to," Ellie said, and meant it two different ways at once. The plan was simple on paper. Marcus carried an encrypted phone he never let out of his jacket, a phone Julian believed held records of every deal Marcus had made behind his back. Ellie's job was to get close enough to lift it, copy what she could, and put it back before he noticed it was gone. She had practiced the movement for 2 nights running, working a decoy phone out of Julian's pocket 100 times until her hands stopped shaking. She found Marcus near the bar, holding court with 2 capos who laughed too hard at everything he said. He noticed her the moment she stepped into his orbit, and something behind his eyes sharpened. The look of a man cataloging a new piece on the board, the famous Waitress. Marcus said, "Julian's little project. I heard you sang like an angel and shattered a glass doing it. I heard a lot of things about you too," Ellie said. "Most of them boring. A few of them interesting." Marcus laughed, delighted. The way men like him were always delighted by a woman who talked back instead of shrinking. "Dance with me," he said. "Let's see if the voice matches the nerve." She said yes because saying no would have been stranger, and let him lead her onto the floor, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. It's close enough that lifting the phone from his jacket became a matter of patience instead of skill. She waited for the turn in the music. The moment his weight shifted and his attention drifted toward a passing waiter, and slid 2 fingers into his jacket pocket, smooth, unhurried, the phone sliding free without so much as a change in his breathing. She palmed it into her clutch before the song ended, across the room. Julian caught her eye for half a second, and something passed between them. Relief, maybe, or pride, though neither of them let it show on their faces for longer than a heartbeat. The garden behind the estate had been strung with soft lights for the evening, and once the phone had been handed off to a technician Julian trusted, quietly copied and quietly returned to Marcus's coat before he noticed the weight difference. Ellie slipped outside to catch her breath. Julian found her there a few minutes later, standing at the edge of a fountain, the noise of the party muffled behind glass doors. "You did that like you've been doing it your whole life. 2 years of being invisible teaches you things," Ellie said. "Nobody watches the hands of a woman they've already decided doesn't matter." "I watch your hands," Julian said. "I've been watching them all night." She turned to look at him properly. The lights from the garden caught the line of his jaw, softened something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the mafia boss who'd set a gun on a tablecloth. Not the man who'd leveled a weapon at her chest in his study. Just Julian, standing close, looking at her like she was the only interesting thing left in a party built entirely on performance. "We got what we needed," she said. "We should go back inside before someone notices we're both missing." "In a minute," Julian said. He reached up, slow enough that she could have stopped him, and brushed a piece of hair back from her face. She didn't stop him. Whatever had started the night he set a gun on a tablecloth and called it a wager had grown into something else entirely, something neither of them had planned for. And standing in the garden with the party murmuring behind them, Ellie let herself stop fighting it. Just for a moment. The kiss, when it came, wasn't rushed. It wasn't the kind of thing either of them could take back afterward, and she understood that even as it happened. Understood that whatever careful distance she'd been keeping between herself and this man had just collapsed completely. For one long, uninterrupted moment, everything felt one. The evidence was copied. The rat was identified. The man holding her wasn't the villain she'd walked into this story expecting to fight. Then the sirens started. They came fast. Red and blue light sweeping across the garden walls before either of them had time to process the sound. 4 SUVs pulled up the drive, doors opening before the engines had fully stopped. Federal agents moving in formation across the lawn, with the practiced efficiency of people who had planned this arrival long before they'd sent the invitations. FBI, everybody stay where you are. Julian's whole body went rigid. Whatever softness had been in his face a moment earlier vanished, replaced by the cold calculation Ellie had seen the night he'd caught her at his safe. Eleanor Vance, one of the agents called out, reading from a tablet. You're under arrest for the murder of federal Judge Harold Whitmore. What? Ellie's voice cracked on the word. I don't even know who that is. His body was found in the trunk of a car registered to you 3 hours ago, the agent said, closing the distance. Cuffs already out. You have the right to remain silent. She turned to Julian, desperate. Certain this was some mistake that would unravel the second he spoke up. The second he told them who she really was and where she'd been all night. He said nothing, his jaw was tight. His hands were tight, and every instinct in his body was clearly screaming at him to step between her and the agents closing in. But he stood perfectly still instead, watching them cuff her wrists behind her back, watching them walk her across the lawn toward a waiting car. Julian, she said, her voice breaking on his name. Julian, say something. He didn't move. Not one muscle, and in that frozen silence, Ellie understood, with a clarity sharper than anything she'd felt since the night she first sang in the ivory room, that she had been set up, and set up well, by someone who'd known exactly how to make the man beside her choose his cover story over her freedom. The last thing she saw before they put her in the car was Julian's face, still and unreadable, watching her go. The holding cell was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Ellie sat on the metal bench with her wrists rubbed raw from the cuffs and replayed the last hour over and over, searching for the version of it where Julian said something, did something. Anything besides stand there and let them take her. She found nothing. Every replay ended the same way. Silence, his jaw tight, his hands still. His loyalty apparently pointed somewhere other than at her. She thought about her father, about a tape she'd never heard but had always been told existed, about the ways men in this world learn to protect themselves first and everyone else second. She'd spent 2 years believing herself invisible and safe from that kind of betrayal, because nobody important enough to betray her had ever bothered to notice she existed. Now she understood the cost of being noticed. It came with the price of being useful right up until the moment you weren't. They moved her before dawn, a transport van with 2 federal marshals and reinforced doors, driving out towards a facility 2 hours from the city. Ellie sat handcuffed in the back, watching the highway lights blur past the small reinforced window, and tried to convince herself that whatever came next couldn't be worse than the silence in Julian's face. The van jerked hard to the left without warning, throwing her against the wall of the compartment. Gunfire cracked outside, short and controlled, professional. One marshal shouted, then went silent. The van rocked again, metal screaming against metal. And the back doors were wrenched open from the outside before she'd even registered the vehicle had stopped moving. Julian stood in the opening, blood on his sleeve that wasn't his, a gun in one hand, and something that looked almost like fear in his eyes. The first time she'd seen anything close to it on his face. We don't have much time, he said, reaching for her cuffs with a key that had clearly been prepared in advance. I need you to trust me for the next 10 minutes. And then you can hate me for as long as you want after that. You let them take me. Her voice came out ragged, torn between fury and the sheer disorientation of being rescued by the same man who'd stood frozen while she was arrested. I did, Julian said, working the cuffs free, because the second I stepped in, they'd have known I was protecting you. And that would have made you a target for every enemy I have, instead of just the one who set this up. I needed you processed into the system quietly, so I could pull you out of it just as quietly. It was the only way to keep you alive. You could have told me the plan. There wasn't time. And there wasn't a version of that conversation the marshals wouldn't have overheard, Julian said. I know what it looked like. I know what it cost you to stand there and watch me do nothing. I'm sorry for that. I'd make the same choice again, because the alternative got you killed instead of arrested. But I'm still sorry. She wanted to stay angry. Some part of her held on to the anger for another few seconds, out of principle. out of the old habit of protecting herself from men who explained away their silence with logic instead of feeling. But the blood on his sleeve was real. The bruises forming on his knuckles were real. He had come for her with his own hands instead of sending someone else. And that meant something. Even if it didn't erase the hours she'd spent believing he'd abandoned her. They drove through the dark in a different car. One Julian produced from somewhere he clearly kept prepared for exactly this kind of emergency. And by the time the sun came up, they were deep into the mountains, following a narrow road that ended at a cabin tucked into the snow, isolated, unremarkable, the kind of place nobody would think to look. Inside, Julian built a fire while Ellie sat wrapped in a blanket, still shaking from adrenaline and cold in roughly equal measure. He knelt in front of her afterward and checked her wrists where the cuffs had cut into her skin. His hands careful, gentle in a way that felt strange coming from someone capable of the violence she'd just watched him use to get her out of that van. "You could have died tonight," he said quietly, cleaning the raw skin with a cloth. "Both times. Getting arrested and getting you out, I know. I've spent 8 years building walls around myself so nothing could get close enough to be used against me," Julian said. "You got past every one of them in 3 weeks. And I don't know how to feel about that except terrified. Terrified isn't a word I expected from you." "It's the only honest one I have left tonight," Julian said, and looked up at her. And whatever mask he usually wore had slipped completely, leaving nothing behind it but a man who had almost lost something he hadn't let himself admit he wanted. "I love you," he said. "I don't know when it happened. I only know it did. Somewhere between the Aria and the safe and tonight. And I couldn't say it while you were in that cell because saying it would have meant admitting how much power that gave someone to hurt me through you." Ellie sat very still, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, the firelight moving across his face. She thought about every reason she had to keep her guard up. Every lesson 2 years of invisibility had taught her about trusting men who claimed to want more than her usefulness. Then she thought about his hands on her wrists, careful and slow, and the blood on his sleeve that he hadn't stopped to explain, because getting her out mattered more than his own comfort. She reached for him instead of answering, and he met her halfway. And whatever words might have come next dissolved into something that needed none. The night that followed was slow and unhurried. Nothing like the danger that had brought them there. Nothing like the violence waiting somewhere behind them in the dark. For the first time since she'd walked into the ivory room with a tray in her hands, Ellie let herself be fully seen, every part of herself, without flinching, without the old instinct to make herself smaller. Julian didn't ask her to be anything other than exactly what she was, and in the quiet after, wrapped in blankets in front of a dying fire, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in years, safe. "We're untouchable here," Julian murmured against her hair, his voice heavy with something close to sleep. "Nobody knows this place exists." Ellie almost believed him. She wanted to believe him. Then the smell reached her, faint at first, drifting up through the gaps in the floorboards, sharp and unmistakable even half asleep, gasoline. Julian was on his feet before Ellie fully understood what her body had already recognized. He crossed to the window in 3 strides and went still, the particular stillness of a man calculating how much time he had left before choices stopped being an option. "Get dressed," he said. Now outside, the snow around the cabin glowed faintly orange at the edges of the tree line, a color that didn't belong in a winter landscape. Ellie pulled her clothes on with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and joined him at the window, in time to see the first line of fire catch along the perimeter, a ring of flame spreading fast through gasoline-soaked brush, closing around the cabin from every direction at once. "They found us," Ellie said. "Marcus found us," Julian corrected, already moving, pulling weapons from a bag she hadn't known he'd brought. "Nobody else knew about this place except the 2 people who helped me plan your extraction, and one of them has been compromised for months. I should have known he'd sell the location the second I used it." Smoke began seeping through the floorboards, thin gray threads at first, then thicker, curling up through the gaps between the old wooden planks. The fire outside had grown loud enough to hear through the walls now, a low roar that seemed to be closing in from every side, feeding on dry brush and old pine needles until the whole tree line looked like it was breathing flame. "There's no way around it," Julian said. checking the door, then the windows, each one showing the same wall of orange light pressing closer. They've boxed us in completely. We go through it, or we don't go at all. Ellie's eyes stung from the smoke thickening in the cabin's low ceiling, and she coughed hard enough to double over, one hand braced against the wall for balance. This was the closest she had come to real fear since the night in Julian's study with a gun pointed at her chest. Worse, because a gun was at least a threat she understood the shape of. Fire had no aim. It simply consumed whatever stood in its path. Indiscriminate, patient, unhurried by anything except the wind. There's a gap, Julian said, pointing through the smoke toward the north wall, where the ring of flame hadn't fully closed yet. A narrow stretch of unburned snow, maybe 20 feet wide. It won't stay open long. We run for it the second I get that door clear. He soaked his coat in the kitchen sink, wringing it out fast, and wrapped it around both of them as best he could. A thin, imperfect shield against heat that had already begun blistering the paint on the walls. Ellie pressed close against him, one hand fisted in the fabric, and tried to keep her breathing steady, even as the smoke thickened enough to blur the edges of the room. Julian kicked the door open. It came apart easier than it should have, wood already weakened by heat, and beyond it lay a corridor of fire on either side. The narrow gap of clear snow just visible through the smoke, closing fast as the wind shifted the flames. Now, Julian said, and they ran. The heat hit Ellie's skin like something solid, a wall she had to physically push through, her lungs burning with every breath of superheated air. Julian's arms stayed locked around her shoulders the whole way, guiding her, shielding her body with his own on the side where the fire burned closest. And for the length of that run, maybe 15 seconds, maybe less, the entire world narrowed down to nothing but heat and smoke and the sound of her own heartbeat. They broke through into open snow just as gunfire opened up from the tree line beyond the flames. Marcus's men had been waiting for exactly this moment, positioned in a loose perimeter around the fire's edge, rifles trained on the gap they'd left deliberately unburned. Julian shoved Ellie down hard, both of them dropping into the snow as bullets tore through the air where they'd been standing a second earlier. And for a moment, all Ellie could do was press herself flat and pray the white ground would be enough to hide them. It wasn't. Julian rose first, returning fire toward the muzzle flashes in the trees, buying seconds. Just seconds. Enough for Ellie to scramble toward what little cover a fallen log offered. She heard the shot before she saw it land. A single crack that sounded different from the rest, and turned in time to see Julian's body jerk twice. Hard, the impact has spinning him half round before he dropped. Julian. She was on her knees beside him before she registered moving, her hands pressing uselessly against his chest where blood was already soaking dark through the fabric of his shirt. 2 wounds close together, high on his torso. His breathing already shallow and wet in a way that made her stomach drop through the frozen ground beneath them. "Stay with me," she said, her voice cracking apart on every word. "Julian, stay with me, please." His eyes found hers for one long second, unfocused, fighting to stay open. And his mouth moved like he was trying to say something she'd never get to hear. Because that was the moment rough hands closed around her arms and wrenched her backward, away from him, away from the blood soaking into the snow beneath his still body. "No," she screamed, fighting against the grip dragging her toward the tree line, twisting hard enough to tear skin on her wrists where fingers dug in like manacles. "No, let me go, Julian." She caught one last look at him before the trees swallowed the view, motionless in the red-stained snow, the fire behind him painting the whole scene in shades of orange and black. The man who had pulled her out of a burning cabin, now lying in the wreckage of the one he'd started. And Ellie understood, screaming and dragged and utterly powerless, that whatever safety she'd felt in his arms hours earlier had just been proven exactly as fragile as she'd always feared it might be. The warehouse smelled like rust and standing water, the kind of place built for storage and left to rot once whatever it once held had moved on. Chains hung from a support beam near the center of the floor, old, industrial, meant for cargo, not people, though Marcus's men used them on Ellie anyway, looping them around her wrists and hoisting her arms just high enough that her shoulders burned within the first hour. She had stopped counting the hours somewhere after the second time Marcus walked in to look at her, the way a man checks on something he's still deciding what to do with. Julian was dead. She had watched him take 2 bullets to the chest and drop into blood-stained snow. And every version of hope she tried to build after that collapsed under the weight of what her own eyes had shown her. She hung from the chains and let herself grieve in pieces. Because grieving all at once would have broken something in her she needed intact if she wanted any chance of surviving what came next. Marcus finally came in properly near what she guessed was midnight, dragging a folding chair across the concrete, the scrape of metal on stone echoing through the empty space. He sat down in front of her, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, and studied her with the patient interest of a man who had all the time in the world. "You know," he said, "I expected you to break faster. Most people do, once the person they love is gone. It usually only takes a few hours before they start begging." "I'm not most people." "No," Marcus agreed. "You're something more interesting. The daughter of Michael Vance, hiding in plain sight as a waitress for 2 years, waiting for her chance at revenge. I have to admit, I underestimated you at that gala. Underestimated the Aria too, if I'm honest." Very dramatic. "Where's the phone I stole?" Ellie said. "You know I copied it. You know Julian had proof." "Julian's dead," Marcus said, watching her face carefully as he said it, cataloging every flicker of pain the words produced. "Whatever proof he had, it dies with him. I'll clean up the rest quietly, the way I always have." He rose from the chair and crossed to a metal cart near the wall, wheeling it closer, an old tape recorder sitting on top. Dust wiped it away in a rough circle where someone had recently handled it. He set it on a crate beside her and pressed play without another word. The voice that came through the static was rough, exhausted, unmistakably familiar, even distorted through decades-old tape. Her father's voice. Ellie's whole body went still, chains creaking faintly with the effort of not moving. "Please, I'll give you anything. Names, accounts, whatever you want. Just leave my wife and daughter out of it. I'll tell you where the money is. I'll tell you everything. Just don't touch them, please. I'm begging you." The tape kept running, her father's voice fracturing further with every sentence. Offering up secrets. Offering up people. Offering up everything he had ever claimed to protect in exchange for a few more minutes of his own survival. As Ellie had spent 9 years believing her father died a hero, refusing to give up anything to the men who killed him. The tape told a different story. One where the man she'd built her entire sense of justice around had folded the second real pressure was applied. "Your father wasn't the martyr you've spent your whole life avenging," Marcus said, switching off the recorder once it finished. "He was a coward who sold out everyone he loved to buy himself another hour. I let him live an extra day after that tape, just to watch him understand what he'd become. Then I killed him anyway. Because cowards aren't useful once they've given up everything they have." Something in Ellie broke loose at that. Not a scream. Not tears. Something quieter and far more dangerous. The last support beam holding up years of certainty finally giving way. She had built her entire sense of self around a story that no longer existed. A father who died protecting his family instead of trying to sell them. For a long moment she hung there in silence, chains creaking softly with the small movements of her breathing, and let herself feel the full weight of it. The revenge she'd built her life around for 2 years. The anger that had gotten her through every humiliating shift. Every insult from people like Chloe Harrington. All of it had been standing on a foundation that had just been proven false. Marcus watched her, clearly expecting her to shatter completely. Expecting the tears and the begging he'd promised himself he'd get eventually. He leaned in close, his voice dropping into something almost gentle. The tone of a man delivering a final, satisfying cruelty. Nothing left to fight for now. "Is there?" Ellie lifted her head. Her eyes were dry. "My father's sins don't define my worth," she said, and her voice, hoarse from hours of silence, came out steadier than she expected. "You think that tape breaks me. It doesn't. It just means I stopped fighting for the wrong reason a long time before I realized it." "You're chained to a beam," Marcus said, some of the amusement draining out of his face. "You have nothing left. I have everything I've ever actually needed," Ellie said. "You kill people because you're empty inside, Marcus. You think fear is the same thing as respect. And you've spent your whole life mistaking one for the other, because nobody ever taught you the difference. But I'm still breathing, and you're nothing. You've always been nothing. A man who needs chains and tape recordings and dead fathers just to feel powerful for 5 minutes. A red light blinked on the small camera mounted above the doorway, one Ellie hadn't noticed until now. Streaming whatever happened in this warehouse to somewhere she couldn't guess. She looked directly into the lens, steady, unflinching, and let whoever was watching see exactly what Marcus's cruelty had failed to produce. Marcus's face twisted. Whatever satisfaction he'd been expecting curdling fast into something uglier. He drew a gun from his jacket, hand shaking with a rage he no longer bothered to hide, and pressed the barrel to her temple. You want to die with dignity, he said. Fine. Let's see how much dignity is left once. The explosion tore through the far wall before he finished the sentence. A wave of heat and debris that threw Marcus sideways and rattled the chains hard enough to jar Ellie's shoulders loose from where they'd been hanging. Smoke and dust rolled through the warehouse in the aftermath. And through it, moving fast, unmistakable even covered in soot and blood, came a figure she had watched die in the snow less than a day earlier, Julian. He shouldn't have been alive. Ellie's mind kept snagging on that fact even as her eyes confirmed it. Julian moving through the smoke with a gun in each hand, blood staining his shirt in 2 places where the fabric had been torn away. A heavy dent visible in the vest beneath it where 2 rounds had struck and stopped short of anything vital. Kevlar, she understood in a rush of relief so sharp it nearly buckled her knees. He'd worn a vest that night, one built to absorb exactly the kind of hit he'd taken. And whatever internal bruising the impact had left him with, it hadn't been enough to keep him from tracking Marcus's men across 2 states to get to this warehouse. Gunfire erupted through the smoke as Julian's people breached from 2 directions at once. A coordinated assault that scattered Marcus's guards into confused, disorganized fire. Ellie hung from the chains and watched chaos unfold around her, unable to do anything but wait. Every second stretching long and thin while bullets cracked off metal shelving and concrete. Marcus recovered fast despite the blast, dragging himself upright through the smoke. And when he saw Julian closing the distance toward Ellie, he made the only move left available to a man who understood he'd already lost the fight on every other front. He grabbed her by the hair, wrenching her sideways hard enough to make her cry out, and pressed his gun beneath her jaw, using her body as a wall between himself and Julian's aim. "Stop," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and panic. "One more step and I put a bullet through her." Julian froze mid-stride, both weapons still raised but with no clean angle. Marcus positioned directly behind Ellie, with barely an inch of exposure showing past her shoulder. Above them, through the ruined section of roof the explosion had torn open, a massive skylight hung in fractured pieces. Decades of neglect leaving the old glass warped and thin, held together mostly by rust and stubbornness. "Let her go," Julian said, his voice carrying an edge Ellie had never heard from him before, something raw underneath the control. "This is between you and me. It always was." "It stopped being between us the second she walked into your life," Marcus snarled. "She's the reason everything unraveled. The account, the tape, all of it. I'll finish this the way I should have finished it weeks ago." Elle's mind raced through every option and found almost none of them survivable. Marcus's grip on her hair kept her head pinned at an angle that made any sudden movement a risk of the gun going off by accident as much as intention. Julian couldn't get a shot without risking her. The standoff held, seconds stretching into what felt like minutes. Gunfire from the rest of the warehouse slowly dying down as Julian's people gained ground against Marcus's scattered forces. Then Ellie remembered the champagne glass. 2 years of vocal training had taught her more than scales and breath control. It had taught her the physics buried inside every note, the way sound moved through air as vibration, the way certain frequencies could find the exact weakness in a piece of glass and shake it apart from the inside. She'd cracked a champagne flute the night she sang for a wager she never expected to win. She'd spent 4 years at Juilliard learning why that happened, the science behind the drama. Resonant frequency meeting compromised structure. The skylight above them, warped and thin with decades of neglect, was exactly that. Compromised structure, waiting for the right frequency to find it. She dropped her weight suddenly, going limp in Marcus's grip, and the shift in balance was enough to loosen his hold on her hair by an inch. Just enough room to tilt her head back and fill her lungs completely. Marcus barked a warning, tightening his grip again, but by then it was already too late to stop what came next. Ellie opened her mouth and sang. It wasn't the aria from Tosca this time. It was a single note, held pure and sustained, climbing upward with a control that came from years of discipline, meeting a lifetime of being told her voice. Her body, her whole self took up too much space. She poured every ounce of that discipline into a note that filled the ruined warehouse from wall to wall, rising, holding, refusing to break. Aimed directly at the fractured glass hanging above them. The skylight shattered, it came apart all at once. 100 pieces of old, brittle glass raining down in a glittering curtain, catching the light from the fires, still burning somewhere behind them, and turning the whole moment into something that looked, for one suspended second, almost beautiful before it turned deadly. Shards fell across Marcus's shoulders and the back of his neck, sharp enough to draw blood through his jacket, and his grip on Ellie broke completely as he flinched away from the falling glass, one hand rising instinctively to protect his face. It was all the opening Julian needed. The shot came fast, clean, precise, a single round finding Marcus in the space of that one flinching second, and he dropped without another word, the gun clattering from his hand across the concrete floor. The glass kept falling around them for another few seconds, catching the firelight. And then the warehouse went quiet except for the fading echo of Ellie's held note dying against the walls. She stood in the middle of it, chains hanging loose from her wrists where the explosion had jarred the bolts free, covered in dust and fine shards of glass that hadn't managed to cut her, breathing hard, alive in a way that felt almost unbelievable given everything that had led to this moment. Julian crossed the distance between them in seconds. Weapon dropped, both hands reaching for her face, checking for injuries with a desperation that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with a man who had spent the last 12 hours believing he might not make it in time. "You're alive," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "I thought I'd lost you the second Marcus had you alone. I thought I'd lost you first," Ellie said, her own voice unsteady, her hands finding the vest beneath his ruined shirt, confirming with her fingers what her eyes had already told her. The blood in the snow. "I watched you go down, Kevlar," Julian said. "It hurt like hell, and I was out cold for longer than I should have been, but it held. I woke up in the snow with 2 of my men trying to figure out if I was breathing, and the second I confirmed I was. I made sure every resource I had went toward finding this warehouse before Marcus finished what he'd started." Ellie looked around at the wreckage, the broken glass still settling across the concrete, Marcus's body still where he'd fallen, and understood, standing amid all of it, that the version of herself who had walked into this warehouse, chained and grieving, no longer existed. Something had been forged in the hours between. Something that didn't need a father's memory or a stranger's approval to know its own worth. Julian sank to his knees in front of her, unprompted, his head lowering in a gesture that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with reverence. A man who had just watched a woman shatter glass with her own voice and understood, completely, that he had underestimated exactly how much power had been standing beside him the entire time. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "Not after tonight, not after any of this." Ellie reached down and pulled him back to his feet, her hands steady now, the shaking finally gone. "You don't get to kneel to me," she said. "We build whatever comes next standing up, together, or we don't build it at all." The cathedral had stood in the city for over 100 years, its stone walls holding the weight of countless weddings, funerals, and everything in between. And on the morning Ellie walked down its center aisle, sunlight broke through the tall stained glass windows exactly the way the architect had designed it centuries earlier, casting deep red light across the marble floor. She had chosen the gown herself this time, no stylist tightening laces around her ribs. No whispered suggestions about hiding her shape for the sake of a silhouette. The dress fit the way the green gown at the gala had fit, built around her instead of against her. And when she stepped through the cathedral doors and the entire room rose to its feet, she felt none of the old instinct to shrink herself smaller for the sake of other people's comfort. She sang as she walked, an aria she'd chosen months earlier for exactly this moment, her voice filling the vaulted ceiling the same way it had filled the ivory room the night this whole story began. Except now there was no wager attached to it. No man betting her worth against another woman's cruelty. There was only the music, and the truth underneath it, that her voice had never needed anyone's expression to matter. Julian waited for her at the altar, dressed in charcoal gray instead of his usual black, and the look on his face when she reached him carried none of the calculation she'd first seen in him at the Ivory Room. 8 months of rebuilding, of dismantling the parts of his organizations that had run on fear and replacing them with something closer to what he'd always claimed to want, had changed something fundamental in how he carried himself. He looked, standing there in the red light pouring through the windows, like a man who had finally stopped bracing for the next betrayal. The ceremony itself was brief, the words simple, and when the officiant asked for the rings, Julian reached into his jacket and produced not one ring but two. The first, a simple band, he slid onto her finger the way any groom might. The second, he held for a moment longer, turning it in the light so she could see the syndicate's old signet engraved into the metal, the same ring his father had worn, the same ring every head of the organization had carried for 3 generations. "This isn't a wedding gift," he said, quiet enough that only she in the front rows could hear. "It's an acknowledgement. Whatever we build from here, we build it together. Equal share, equal say, no exceptions." He pressed the ring into her palm instead of her finger, and closed her hand around it. And the meaning of the gesture rippled through the crowd of capos and allies gathered in the pews, every one of them understanding exactly what it signified. Power in this organization, going forward, would not sit with one person alone. The reception afterward stretched long into the evening, and for the first time in longer than Ellie could remember, she moved through a room full of powerful people and felt no urge to make herself smaller for their comfort. She ate what she wanted. She laughed loudly when something struck her as funny. She danced with Julian in the center of the floor, while people who once might have laughed at her, the way Chloe Harrington had watched instead, with something closer to respect. Chloe herself sent no card, no gift, no acknowledgement of the wedding at all, and Ellie found she didn't need one. Whatever cruelty that woman had aimed at her the night this story began had long since stopped mattering, buried under everything that came after it. A year passed in something close to peace. Julian's organization, restructured piece by piece, moved further from its bloody origins with every quarter. Legitimate businesses replacing the ones that had once relied on fear to function. Ellie sang again, properly, a return to the stage she'd walked away from years earlier. Her name appearing on programs at concert halls that would never have hired her when she was a waitress with a Juilliard scholarship gathering dust. She thought, sometimes, about the lesson buried underneath everything that had happened to her, the one she'd spoken aloud in a warehouse with a gun pressed to her skull. Worth wasn't something handed down by a bloodline, or measured by the space a body took up, or determined by whether the people around you decided to notice you at all. It came from somewhere steadier than any of that. Somewhere nobody could take away no matter how hard they tried. One evening, returning to the penthouse after a late rehearsal, Ellie found Julian already home, standing very still beside the grand piano in the main room, staring down at something that hadn't been there when they left that morning. An unmarked black box sat on the piano's polished surface, small, plain, deliberately anonymous. Julian lifted the lid slowly, and Ellie came to stand beside him, watching his face change as he took in what was inside. A single silver bullet rested on a bed of folded sheet music, the paper old, slightly yellowed, printed with the opening bars of Mozart's Requiem across the top of the page, in handwriting that looked disturbingly deliberate. Someone had written a single word in something dark enough to be blood. Encore. Ellie stared at it for a long moment, feeling the peace of the last year settle into something more watchful, more alert. The old instincts she'd built during her worst months rising back to the surface without effort. Julian's hand found hers, steady despite what sat open on the piano in front of them. "Whoever this is," he said, "they picked the wrong 2 people to test." Ellie looked at the sheet music, at the bullet gleaming dully against the folded paper, and felt something that wasn't quite fear settle into her spine instead. Readiness, maybe. The understanding that whatever came next, she would not face it as the invisible waitress who once flinched at spilled wine. She would face it as exactly who she'd become. Let them try. she said and closed the box. In the end, Ellie's story is not simply about a waitress who sang an aria, or a mafia boss who made a dangerous wager in a room full of cruel people. It is a story about worth, dignity, and the kind of strength the world often refuses to see until it is too late. Ellie began this journey as a woman everyone underestimated. To the wealthy guests at the Ivory Room, she was only a plus-size waitress carrying a tray. To Chloe, she was someone to humiliate. To Julian, at first, she was a mystery wrapped in a voice powerful enough to stop an entire room. But what none of them understood was that Ellie had never been weak. She had only been waiting for the right moment to stop hiding. The greatest lesson this story gives us is that a person's value is not decided by their body, their job, their past, or the cruel opinions of people who look down on them. Ellie's voice was not just music. It was her truth. It was the part of her that no insult, no betrayal, no chain, and no enemy could take away. Even when Marcus tried to destroy her with secrets about her father, Ellie realized something powerful. Her father's sins did not define her worth. Her pain did not define her future. Her humiliation did not erase her power. Julian's journey also teaches an important lesson. Power means nothing without respect. Fear can build an empire, but it cannot build love, loyalty, or peace. Julian had to learn that protecting Ellie did not mean owning her, controlling her, or deciding her life for her. True love means standing beside someone as an equal. It means seeing their strength, not just their wounds. It means building a future together, not forcing someone to live inside your shadow. And perhaps the deepest meaning of this story is this: the people who are mocked, ignored, and underestimated may be carrying the very power that changes everything. Ellie did not win because she became someone else. She won because she finally stood fully as herself. Her body, her voice, her intelligence, her courage, her scars, and her truth all became part of her victory. So let this story remind us: never shrink yourself to make cruel people comfortable. Never let the world tell you that you are too much, too ordinary, too damaged, or too late to rise. Sometimes the person everyone laughs at is the one who will shatter the glass ceiling. Sometimes the woman they call invisible is the one who sees every secret. And sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in a room full of powerful men is not a gun, a fortune, or a throne. It is a woman who finally knows her own worth. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.